Welcome to Pending Final, the podcast covering all the things you never knew about VFX. What's up, everybody? We are finally in the double digits of Pending Final with our episode 10, where we are tackling a very big and broad topic to where it's going to be separated into two episodes, and that is VFX as a business. Now, I think it was interesting. Both Helen and I were talking to some people the other day, and this is why this topic has kind of come into fruition, basically, was people don't understand that VFX is not just a bunch of people in a room doing stuff. There's a HR department. There is a business side to it and things. And it's one of those, we just thought, you know what, we need to really just talk about all aspects. We've been talking about departments and disciplines and principles, but we haven't talked about it as a business. So first of all, I'm going to introduce my lovely co-host, Helen. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm ready to talk about this. There's a lot of stuff to go into, and I think a lot of it's super interesting and maybe not things that people have thought about before.
Yes.
Because it's not just, when we say VFX as a business, we're not just talking as a single business, but as a group of businesses working together to produce, your Captain Marvels.
Yeah, think about it as kind of like pulling back the curtain and revealing the guy who's, running the big green face in The Wizard of Oz. It's kind of what we're doing literally. Yeah, pretty much. So Helen, kind of start us off. What are we going to cover kind of first overall?
Okay, so we've got a bunch of different sections of things that we want to be talking about. So first of all, I want to be talking about who the VFX team is. So there's two different sides to visual effects. That is the filmmakers themselves, who are going to be asking for visual effects to be made to put into their movie. And then there's the VFX vendors, who are the people who actually make those things. So what we're going to be talking about in this episode or pair of episodes are the people who are actually the filmmakers who want that visual effect shot done. Then I want to talk about on-set visual effects. So this is what the VFX team are doing when they're on set, what they are looking for, things that they're responsible for, all that sort of good stuff. So all the things that need to be done in order for the VFX vendors to be able to do their job properly. Then a big thing is budgets and bidding and things like that. This is about how the filmmakers themselves decide how much money they're going to be spending on their visual effects, how they're going to proportion out that money, how they're going to work out what it is they actually want. So this is actually a super important thing as well.
And this is also a very important thing to remember, because we've kind of briefly mentioned it in some prior episodes, to where how can, some visual effect companies who have won Oscars for some films then create other visual effects for films and it look absolutely garbage. And this is kind of where you will see it's all down to budget, time and things like that. But we'll go down into further detail when we get to that part.
Yeah, exactly. We also want to talk about the VFX vendors, but kind of from the filmmaker's perspective. So who it is that they're looking for, how they pick a vendor, which is always a super interesting thing to think about, what it is, how that relationship gets built. And then we're going to go into actual post-production. So what it is that the filmmakers do whilst the visual effects companies are doing their visual effects, because there's a whole bunch of other stuff that they're doing. They're not just coming in for reviews and saying, approved, final.
Yeah. As you say. Cool. So now we're going to talk about who is the VFX team, and what is also sometimes what we're going to be referencing is what we'll say in the industry as client side. So who is all in the VFX team, Helen?
So there's a whole bunch of people who deal with the visual effects on the client side of things, on the actual filmmaking side of things. The two biggest names you will see are the visual effects supervisor and the visual effects producer. So the VFX supervisor is the person who usually work very closely with the director. They will tend to have the same sort of artistic vision as the director. Obviously, you will have shows sometimes where they don't necessarily align, and those can maybe be a tougher show to work on because, you want to make sure those creatives are, have the same vision for this end product. So the VFX supervisor is the person who decides when a shot is done in the visual effects realm of things. They are the ones often who present it to the director and say, hey, here's, how you wanted that shot of Spider-Man swinging through New York. Here's the shot of Spider-Man swinging through New York. I've approved it, just getting your sign off, and then we'll put it in. So they're the people who actually make those creative decisions. They are partnered with a visual effects producer, and the visual effects producer is the person who organizes the whole thing. They are making sure that everything is being done under or on budget, preferably under. They are also often the person who gets to rein in that visual effects supervisor. If you have a soup who is saying, how about we do this, and we can do this as well, and this as well, and this as well, your VFX producer will usually be the person who goes, okay, but we only have a week, so pick one. Or, let's think about how we can take some budget away from something else, and then you can have this big shiny thing that you want. And that happens all the way through from actual pre-production all the way through to approving shots. So it could be, I want this giant green screen extravaganza, and the VFX producer can sort of say, well, for this particular thing, we don't have that much, so, let's actually get a set built, which in some cases can be less expensive than your crazy extensive VFX city that you wanted. So that there's a partnership there to make sure that all gets done. The producer and the supervisor are almost always assisted by a VFX coordinator. They are the person who does all the stuff that the VFX producer physically doesn't have time for. So they will be assisting that VFX producer in, putting things together, in contacting people. They will often be the point of contact for VFX companies. They'll be the ones organizing sessions and making sure that things get put together ready for everyone else. So they are absolutely instrumental. VFX coordinators on set are absolutely worth their weight in gold, because they're the ones who, make sure that everything is running smoothly for the VFX side of things. There's often always for the size of shows that we've been talking about on this podcast, there's almost always a PA, if not more. PAs are there for all of the admin side of things that you don't necessarily need to have a huge amount of VFX experience or film set experience for, but need to get done. So, answering phones, putting documents together, all that admin stuff that still desperately needs to get done, because these productions are enormous. They are sprawling. There are hundreds of people, and you need somebody to help keep that stuff in order. We also often have a data coordinator. They may not necessarily be part of that core VFX team. They may be, say, on loan from the editorial department. They might be bouncing around between different parts of set. But they are the people who make sure that what it is that the VFX vendors will need in the end of it all that stuff actually gets documented and recorded. If there are lens grids to be captured, they make sure that is all recorded and they have everything there for it. So it is a well-oiled machine, and you will always have a VFX supervisor and a VFX producer, but the number of coordinators and PAs can vary wildly from project to project. If you have a small show, you might just have a coordinator. If you have a large, enormous, Avengers Infinity War scale thing, you could have a little team of them. So it really does depend on the size of the project.
It's quite interesting, actually, while Helen is kind of mentioning all this, it's also very commonplace that a lot of them work with the same director or the same studio and things. So it's almost like you start getting kind of like this quote dream team of VFX soups and producers and directors and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And quite often, because the filmmaking side of this, to be honest, across the entirety of filmmaking often tends to be about who you know. You will find that if somebody has worked with someone and it's gone really well, they will often be asked back. This is how often sort of PAs and coordinators get to rise up the ranks, is because if they make a really good impression, then they get asked back, because there aren't really that many job listings for this sort of job. It's often, oh, hey, my friend wants to get into this. Could they, can I recommend them for you? That sort of thing. Like you say, there are a lot of supervisor-producer pairs or supervisor-director pairs that happen. One that I think we can definitely talk about is Rob Legato and Jon Favreau. They've obviously done a whole bunch of stuff together. You do find that, say, if a director, like I say, clicks creatively with someone, that's the whole point of
the collaboration process.
Yeah.
So with that being said, we're going to now transition on to now what happens on set for VFX, say client side, because most of this will kind of be client side. Helen can correct me if I'm wrong. We don't usually, coming from like a vendor side, have people on set. We may a little bit, but it's like...
Yeah, so it's not incredibly frequent, but sometimes you will get a vendor VFX producer on set to help out, or if there's a coordinator or a vendor supervisor who needs to be there just to help out, they will definitely be available. But quite often, all this stuff happens before a vendor has even been picked, which is why you don't tend to get vendors on set. Usually it's when you've got a partnership between a studio and a vendor who, work together very regularly, and they've already decided way in advance, this is who we'll be picking for this. And then you can have somebody available to, just give that extra bit of help. So one of the things I think everyone will recognize from on-set visual effects is green screens. We see them everywhere. They've become pretty ubiquitous in the world, down to the point where even, Twitch streamers have them as backdrops, so they can have whatever they want going, or they can make sure that they are as little as possible in the corner of their screen. There's a whole bunch of commercially and personally sort of available green screens out there. One of the things about green screen is you can't really tell how far away it is, because it is just that huge sea of green. So what you will see often, if you are ever watching behind the scenes documentaries, are little crosses or dots. So these markers are used by the visual effects teams to actually work out where things are placed in the world. If you know that all of the markers are 1 meter apart from each other in all directions, then you can tell based on that how far away that is from the camera. So there's a lot of good information that you can get from marking up your green screen. And as somebody who has been on a project which had no markers, I can tell you it's really, really hard for the artist to work out where these things are in space.
Yes.
Just setting up the green screens is super important, and making sure that's all done. That's obviously not necessarily going to be done by your coordinators or your producers, but they will need to direct sort of your grips, everybody who's on set, who's actually setting these things up. They'll need to direct them, because otherwise no one knows what it is that's needed.
Yes, and things can, it's interesting. Green screen is one of the most basic of VFX techniques now, as Helen has brought up with even the Twitch streamers. It's also kind of when you're learning visual effects and things, one of the first things you test. It is also, though, something that can get so desperately done wrong.
Yeah.
Like, we have, both of us ourselves have dealt with various productions where what happens when you have 3 different colors of green screen? What happens when there's shadows on the green screen? What happens when you've dressed your actors in green and then put them in front of a green screen? Or blue. I've seen blue. And the grade is blue. You're just like, so it's very interesting. And I think because it's, quote, a very simple thing to set up, it's so very easy to get wrong.
It's very easy to get wrong.
Yeah, so it's one of those not to take lightly. And so things like having markers and whatnot, and that's why what happens when you're tracking, sometimes all of a sudden the geometry is going to slip because it doesn't have that firm. I hated tracking, by the way. I hate tracking, but yes.
I don't know, I kind of found it really soothing. You just went into a happy place.
It was funny watching it being tracked, and I was fascinated by the concept of parallax, but I hated doing the math and things. I was like, I hate this. But anyway, I digress. So yes.
No, this is actually a really good point to bring up. Lens grids, which are something that need to be recorded all the time that you're on set. So do you want to go into this, Shannon?
I mean, I know lens grids briefly, but and literally because we get a whole bunch, and I'm talking hundreds of them that we have to then process and then get them ready and things. But because I guess when you're tracking something, all cameras have a lens distortion of some sort. And you have, by doing lens grids, which is usually a checkered pattern, it helps. By filming them, it's usually like a frame or something like that, you get that natural distortion, because then what happens is then once the comp artists do all their magic and things, we have to slightly put that distortion back in. Otherwise, the common person, they may not know why, but a shot will stick out like a sore thumb and go, God, why does that look weird? And that's because it's now been flattened and the camera has not been distorted. So it's those little things, and that you have to think so far up the pipeline, because later down the pipeline it's going to be necessary and needed.
Yeah, and at the same time as those lens grids being captured, which again, like you say, they are just a checkerboard. Often they are a standard sort of 1 inch by 1 inch black and white or dark and light grey. But along with those being recorded, you will have your white balance being recorded. You will have color charts being recorded. Color charts, which sometimes people will overhear the word Macbeth. But those Macbeth charts, which have very certain colors on them, and that means that you can see how those colors are reacting. You can see if there's any, again, distortion in the camera, if there's anything going on in the light that's making greens look blue or something like that. You're getting all that information.
It's very important, because so much is going to happen with those raw scans to the final comps that you need almost like a baseline of this is what the color red looks like. Because let me tell you, it is so easy, even in just kind of the processing phase of getting scans from Onset. And when I'm saying scans, if you don't know, scans are basically the raw takes. By getting scans from set to the vendors, even that can mess up the color. So you need these kind of information and data to get the right things, because otherwise after a while it's just kind of the blind leading the deaf. And then I'm not trying to be harsh, but it is. Yeah. It's like you don't know what's gospel kind of thing, and it becomes very difficult when this is one of the things as a VFX editor I have to maintain and watch and things, is dealing with kind of color and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, it's important. See, everything on set should matter, but it, again, something very simple that should not be taken for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. And you find that things like this, it's not impossible for you to do the work without it, but it does make things an awful lot harder. So if someone needs to track, I don't know, we had an example a while ago of someone's hand being tracked. If someone needs to track that hand and they don't have any information about what the camera was, because obviously different types of camera, if you're using 3 or 4 different brands of camera on set, they will all have different distortions. Mm-hmm. And if you have 2 of the same camera, they might even have very, very slight differences. And if you don't have those lens grids, you can still kind of eyeball it, because you kind of know what a hand looks like and what it should do in different poses, but it can take so much longer. And obviously in this industry, time is money. So the longer something takes, the more expensive it is. So you want to try and make things as quick as possible, because it makes it as cheap as possible for you as the filmmaker yourself.
Exactly.
And that's what VFX producers care about more than anything, is making sure that this is being done and not overspent.
Yes, absolutely. So what about things on set like motion capture and like set scanning? Yeah,
so these are things that we actually talked about in our animation and assets episodes respectively. But these are obviously all things that need to be done on set, or maybe not necessarily at the time of things being recorded. Obviously, you can have some performance capture things that do need to be done whilst you're actually getting those takes and you've got all your actors on set. But if you want to have some motion capture done of a fight scene, that doesn't necessarily need to be done at the same time as having all your actors on set, because quite frequently there'll be stunt guys doing that. But that's something else that the VFX team need to be aware of, because they need to not only get all that recorded, but it also needs to be processed. And and then condense down.
Because, and this is also where I feel the data coordinator is very important. Because, like, for example, in the terms of motion capture, you have a couple things going on. First, you'll have things kind of called witness cameras, which are basically what they sound like, cameras witnessing the action. So that's where you will see the people in the suits with the balls and things like that. Those have to be slated. Those have to be saved, reference to a shot. Then also you have to have the actual take on the motion capture recorder, being it Arena or I think OptiTrack or things like that. That has to be saved because that is a take. So then they're going to have to make sure that all that information is together and things, because otherwise, you know, especially when you see, if I don't know if anyone has ever seen it, but like a raw motion capture, it's kind of like this skeletal figure, but because it's just that, you have no reference. And so if someone does not tie those things together, again, you could be like, I have no idea what I'm looking at. I don't know if this is take 5, 6, or 7 kind of thing. So again, this is where the data coordinators, I'm sure it's the data coordinators who do this. I think that those kind of things are definitely going to be needed and things.
So the capturing of motion capture data is very similar to capturing film footage, in that you can record for hours and hours and days and weeks and weeks and weeks. And then the actual end product is a 2-hour movie. So you don't necessarily want to be working with 2 days worth of motion capture footage when it's only going to be in a 30-second chunk of the movie. So part of this is distilling it down into what you actually want to look at. Because again, time is money. The amount of footage that you're working with, that's also money. So you want to condense that down to exactly what it is that you're working from. Even if you have 2 or 3 takes, that's better than 2 or 3 hours of takes, which you want to just make sure that that's what's getting processed, that's what you're paying for, that's what you're sending to your visual effects companies.
Yes. And then that goes right into our final one for Onset VFX, set scanning.
So we talked about all of this in episode 108, because this is how we know what the set looked like. We've got reference for where everything is. If we need to be building or extending on these environments, we know exactly the size of everything. We know where everything is in relation to each other. And this is all things that, again, you want to get just that one scan. You don't want to be paying for several of them. You want to make sure it's the best it can be. And that's what's getting shipped off. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different things that are dealt with on set. This is obviously just a couple of things. There's huge amount of stuff going on during filming. So there's a whole bunch of things that the VFX team are working on, but this is just sort of a little snapshot of a couple of interesting things.
Yeah. So then that kind of brings on to our next bit of kind of the VFX as a business, which is budgeting and bidding. And this will be a bit of a chunky one because there's a lot that goes on into this.
Yeah, because again, when you're making a movie, you're not just paying for those visual effects to be made. You're also paying for your team to work on it. You're paying not just your VFX vendors, but your motion capture vendors, your LiDAR vendors. There's a whole bunch of different things that you can know up front. Hey, we've used this company before for a day's worth of assistance. It's going to cost this much. You can put that into your budget straight away. So there's a lot of things that you can get a ballpark for fairly quickly. But the place where it starts getting a little bit more difficult is the actual shots themselves, because what the director or the VFX supervisor might be imagining might not necessarily be possible with the amount of money that they have. So when these films get budgeted, they don't go, what would you like to do? Okay, I guess we'll give you this much money. It's definitely the other way around. Like, you have $80 million. Go. It's not necessarily, well, I want to make a giant monster movie with Godzilla killing robots on the moon, and then they go, oh, wow, yeah, that sounds like you'll probably need like many, many millions of dollars. Here you go.
Yeah.
I know that's the way that a lot of people, I think, would love to do it. But
yes.
more frequently, you're getting your budget first.
Yeah.
And obviously when you do see movie budgets, most of that cost that you're seeing is, I think the proportion that people are talking about right now is about 2/3 to 1/3. So 2/3 goes on your production, and 1/3 goes on your post-production, so your VFX. So whatever budget you have, you sort of take a third of it and you say, okay, that's how much they must have spent on visual effects. And you sort of get an idea. Go for it.
Question. So when things I'm curious now, let's see if you know this, but like when they say things go like over budget on productions and things, does it mean that that's now going over budget of those 2/3 and it's dipping into that 1/3, or as an over budget as a whole, or can it be a mixture of both? Do you know?
I think it's probably going to be a mixture. I can imagine having particular shows where they do go, oh no, we need reshoots. That obviously takes money out of the visual effects budget because they are things that perhaps weren't accounted for, and the VFX budget isn't necessarily something that's been spent yet. But overall, it is a pot of money where things can be moved around. If you're able to make savings in one place, it means you can, put more money somewhere else. So, it really would depend on the feature itself. Gotcha.
So now we're kind of going to move into like script breakdowns.
Yeah. So what you will often have on let's always talk about these enormous feature projects because they are the most complex. So there's a lot more to talk about. You can obviously do the same sort of thing with a little movie that only needs some, say, microphones removed from collars and, non-period features removed from rooms, that sort of thing. But for most of what we're talking about, it's these enormous, big budget Hollywood crazy extravaganzas. So what often will happen is, again, you start off with a script, and the script writers will have a vision in mind as well, and often there will be stage directions or some description of the environment, and you will have some scripts where they are very detailed, and you will have some scripts where they are extremely sparse, and you get a bit of a sense of what it is that they're going for. Often, if you have a writer director, they can be fairly specific with their scene descriptions because they know exactly what it is that they will be looking for in the end. Quite often, if you don't necessarily have a writer director or someone who's going across the whole thing, quite frequently with big budget movies you can have a script writer who submits that script and then is fairly removed from the rest of the process, and you get script editors who are entirely different people who come on to help with the rest of the project. So it will be down to a supervisor, a VFX supervisor, someone with that creative eye, someone with that experience to say, okay, this says that they are in the middle of hell. How are we going to show that? What do we need? Should we have an establishing shot of the everything, because we've got a really big budget on this movie, so we can do some big wide establishing shots of pits of tar and boiling people, or we do a really low key sort of hell is a white room. You work out what it is that you can do with that budget. So you'll be able to go through and say, okay, this here says that, a fire monster has come in. So we need to budget out money for a fire monster. So they can go through and get all that information. But frequently it's down to sort of the storyboard section, especially if you have something very conceptual. Like I say, if a script says that you're in the middle of hell, I'm sure that you could have 10 different VFX supervisors give you a concept of what that might look like. So you want to sort of work that out. You work with storyboarders, you work with concept artists. You say, okay, so how are we going to show this? And then once you have those sort of visual landmarks that you can go with, then you start working out, okay, so we need to split out money for this entire environment to be built. We need sort of crowds of demons. We need all these different things. So you can start working out, okay, so these are the things that we'll need. And then you can start letting your vendors know what it is that they'll be expected to make.
Oh, I see. This is actually quite fascinating because I don't know this side of it. But I do see people kind of in our office reading scripts and things like that. And so this makes sense.
Yeah. So once you kind of know where you're going with this, I mean, often a script could come with concept art at the same time. It's all down to sort of the order of things. If you end up working, say, on a project where you've got vendors in from the very beginning and everyone's already working on it together, like from the pitch stage, from even the script writing stage, you can have people already working on, well, here's a couple of different versions of what demons could look like. This is what my river of fire looks like. And you can start going, oh, that's really cool. Let's put that in more shots. So it really does depend, because you might also have a project where you've got your script, you've shot your stuff, and now you've got your rough edit, and now you're taking that to vendors and going, this is what I want in this shot. I would like 10 demons roasting a chicken in the background of this.
Sorry, just roasting a chicken.
I'm literally just coming up with this shit on the fly.
No, it's great. That sounds like an amazing VFX movie, but so yes.
So we've got in the background of this shot, make that. And they've already got that shot breakdown of, okay, in this shot, we have this background, we've got this, this, and this. So it really does depend on the project. So
yes, I'm saying that because like I've worked on a couple projects where it was like, they were pretty much, I could be wrong. This is my perception. Again, I'm kind of the tail end of what we're discussing, but it seems like the last couple of projects I've been on, they're pretty much kind of done. And we're just, we're getting the turnover of the stuff, but like they already kind of know the characters have been decided, all this kind of stuff. The one I'm on right now, it's interesting because it's a wonderful learning experience, because it's almost feeling like it's all happening. What we're discussing now is all happening while we're working on it and things. So it is quite fascinating to hear there can be done both sides.
Yeah. And both of these ways of doing it can also have crazy implications in the cost. If you start off with your vendor and everyone's doing all this conceptual stuff, you can spend a lot of money working out just what your world's going to look like. If you don't have concept art of, what this river of fire is going to look like, you could go through many, many iterations. You could spend a lot of time on it, and you could at the end of it go, let's just have a stone wall instead. So, things like that can happen. Whereas if you have a very specific vision and you're like, the river of fire is going to have a curve here and it's going to have, these things on the riverbank, and the VFX company isn't necessarily hitting that very specific vision that you've had in your head for months, then you can end up, spinning on it for a really long time, because they don't have the exact same perception of reality that you do. So that, things can become expensive in different ways. So there's no necessarily one right way to do it. So you want to have that VFX team who can, if you do have a supervisor who's starting to go, I know, instead of a river of fire, let's have a waterfall of fire. You want to have that VFX producer be able to go, okay, but like the budget means that we can only really have a river. So, rein it in, chill out. So, you've got that, like I say, that very strong partnership there.
Yeah. It sounds like you'd have to be, because like, I can imagine, and this is not referencing anybody in specific, but I can imagine there would be people who are like, I'm going to have this and this and this, and then go, oh, actually, I've changed my mind. I want something completely different. And you have to have almost like a parent to be like, no, this is what we have. This is what we're doing. No, kind of thing.
Yeah, because this industry is crazy. It's commodified art, right?
Yeah.
Like what you're doing is you're selling art to people, and that's very, very subjective.
Yes.
And if you have that supervisor who goes, but it just doesn't look right without the waterfall, then you might just have to make that and just go, okay, that means that these other shots, that we're going to have to make them much cheaper. We need to find a way to reduce that. Maybe we can use some elements of fire instead of actually simulating it. You start working out how to reduce costs in other places in order to make it, that dream shot of that waterfall of fire in that opening establisher.
Would you say then the kind of person like involved then, so like the coordinator who's kind of being the parent basically, needs to be relatively up to speed on what all the disciplines are, and kind of almost in like a troubleshooting sort of way, so they know, oh, okay, well, instead of doing this as a simulation, we'll do this as like stock effects or things like that?
So kind of. So it would actually be the producer who's the one who's
gotcha.
Like being that parent. But often the VFX producers have come from the actual on-set side of things. So they don't necessarily know all of the ins and outs of being, say, a VFX vendor. But what they do have is a entire team of VFX vendors who can say to them, okay, this is how we would do it if you wanted to do this. This is how we can end up doing scenarios for people. There's a lot of back and forth. Because once a budget is decided on, like I say, it's a pot of money. So you're going back and forth and you're saying, hey, for this, we really need to make these shots cheaper because we've got, this waterfall of fire that needs to be done now. Like, what would you suggest? And the VFX vendor can be like, hey, so we can do it like this, 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 and this. We can offer these things. Like maybe, it's also a grander, wider scheme of things, right? So you might be like, that this could go over and we can, take a discount somewhere else. And, it's all business. It's all people, it's just moving money around at the end of the day. So there's ways that you can work it out.
Mm. And so how does, by doing a script breakdown, how does that differ from doing, say, a scene breakdown? Or is that kind of what you're meaning by...
Yeah, so they're kind of the same thing. Scene breakdowns are often... I've heard script breakdowns and scene breakdowns called the same thing, really. But it's just, working out what the footage is that you've got, what it is that you want to be putting in there, and making estimates on how much that's gonna cost you. Like, what percentage of your budget can you put on that thing? So I feel like a scene breakdown, once you actually have filmed material, is a little bit easier to be accurate.
I see.
Because obviously with a script, you could go anywhere, because if that's the first draft of the script, that can be very different from your end product of what gets filmed on the day.
Yes.
You might have actors who aren't available. You might have, something goes nightmarishly wrong and you need to film something completely different because, some piece of equipment hasn't turned up. So what's actually filmed can end up being quite different from the script. So having that edit really helps.
So would you say in scene breakdowns that this is also where they could decide what vendors do what, say if it's a multi-vendor show? Or is that kind of in a different place?
Yeah. I think it could be done at any point, really. But something that really helps with choosing a vendor is being able to provide them with sort of previs or postvis. So previs is, before you do things, you work out what these things might look like. So that's also part of maybe storyboarding, or you can just put in a single image of some concept art of that establisher. And then postvis is usually using filmed footage, adjusting that to the best of your ability. So quite often people are using, Premiere or things like that to, we'll use Premiere's despill to get the green screen out, and we'll put that concept of hell in the background, and now we can give that to the VFX company and go, that's what we want. And the VFX company goes, okay, now let's do that properly.
Okay, I've always wondered, actually, I always knew what previs was, but postvis, I was like, well, that to me is post-visual effects. Well, what's the point? Okay, that makes a bit more sense. Because what you just described, I would still call previs. So that makes sense now. That it's...
Yeah, so previs of that shot would be sort of a drawn picture of that person in front of the concept art because you haven't filmed anything yet. And then postvis is, okay, we have the stuff, here's the shot of that person talking, and now we'll put that element behind
That's them. Cool. Okay. See, I learned something today.
And if you have, there are, companies out there. So I think, I feel like the Imaginarium does postvis. The Third Floor does postvis. A lot of VFX vendors do postvis as well now. But you often, if you're watching, again, these breakdowns of VFX movies, you will see, before you see the nice animation version of a shot, you will often see a much clunkier, sort of slightly disproportioned, maybe the faces are a bit weird, not quite right version of it, because it's just the postvis people are just whacking these things out. They don't necessarily have scans of people to match to. They just know, hey, I need to make, Snow White or whatever in 3D. I don't know what she looks like. Let's just use the original 1930s version and just make her. And then they'll pop that in, and that's what they're using as their postvis.
So that kind of wraps up this episode, but the things we're going to talk about in our part 2 of VFX as a business is going to deep diving into VFX vendors. So that's like picking the vendor and kind of various pitch reels and show reels and things like that. And then also deep diving kind of into post-production and talking about things like, say, FileMaker, Shotgun, data sheets, count sheets, kind of now, how do we get that communication from offset to now the various, companies and things that are going to be making your shots. So tune in. That will be our wonderful episode 11. So Helen, where can they find us?
We are at Pending Final on Twitter. We are Pending Final on Facebook, at Pending Final Podcast on Instagram. And you can email us if you send an email to pendingfinal@gmail.com.
And we're also on YouTube. If YouTube is more your thing, we're currently trying to reach 100 subscribers so we can have a URL. But as always, we will link the description to the video episodes on our Twitter and Instagram account. So with that, we will see you guys next time.
Bing!